Welcome back to the OIS podcast. This week's episode is a discussion on industry insights and innovating internationally, which was held last month during the OIS Israel virtual program. Let's listen in for insightful perspectives from the panel.
Hello, I'm William Link, and I'll be moderating this panel, Industry Insights and Innovating Internationally. Our discussion will focus on innovation in the fields of vision science, ophthalmology, and optometry, and we can refer to this comprehensively as the eye health sector. We will share our perspectives on where innovation happens in our field, both geographically, but also structurally, in the private sector, public sector, corporate sector, etc. And of course, we'll discuss the role and impact that Israel has on innovation in our field. First, we'll each make a few comments and introduce ourselves regarding our current activity and responsibility, as well as our background in the field of eye health. I'll start. I started out as an engineer. I'm a bit rusty. Now as an engineer, I graduated from Purdue University in the Midwest with a PhD in mechanical engineering, and thankfully was also trained as a veterinarian, so became somewhat of a biomedical engineer before it was even a field. I've been in the ophthalmology eye health field for over 40 years. I had red in my hair when I started in the field of ophthalmology back in the day. In the first 20 or so years, I founded and built two ophthalmic device companies, AMO, now J&J Vision, and Chiron Vision, now Bausch & Lomb Surgical. I then transitioned into investing with Versant Ventures and more recently with Flying L Partners. I have actively invested in and been on the boards of over 25 ophthalmic startups. So it's been a privilege to be immersed in this space of ophthalmic innovation. And now for our panel members. First, Dr. Barack Osmond is a serial entrepreneur and is a trained ophthalmologist. He was a venture partner at Acuitive Medical Ventures and has been a founder of, I think, at least 5 in the ophthalmic space, 5 companies. Barack, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Bill. Hi, everyone. So 20 years ago, I left practice from the Tel Aviv Medical Center together with my partner, Yair Oster, and we started our first company, Notal. At that time, physician living practice for industry was pretty rare, and you should have seen my mother when I told her what I'm going to do, but it worked out pretty well. Since Notal, we have started 4 other companies. We are developing contact lenses, accommodative IOL, dry eye drug, and diagnostics. I've been following and involved very much in the Israeli ophthalmic startup scene since it's basically begun. Since when I started, unlike Bill, didn't have red hair, but I did have hair, not anymore. So we are trying to help also young entrepreneurs, basically for them not to do all the mistakes we have done and to create new mistakes. So that's a lot of fun for us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Barack. Laurent Atias is a member of the executive committee of Alcon as the Senior Vice President of Corporate Development Strategy. Laurent leads the corporate development strategy for Alcon, which includes business development and licensing, mergers, and acquisitions. Laurent, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Bill. First of all, I'd like to thank you and applaud the initiative of doing this special OIS with an emphasis on Israel. Look, I have 25 plus years in ophthalmology, all of them with Alcon. I'm originally from France. I had a chance to study in the United States, both undergrad and graduate school in Texas, which put me next to Alcon, basically. and had a chance to work up a career into pharmaceuticals first, and then moved over to devices in the field of IOLs and launched some new products there. And then I spent some time running the division of refractive for Alcon worldwide, involved in the R&D of that too. And then started some operational roles with countries like Canada. I had a chance to work there for almost 3 years, and then moved over to the European theater based in Geneva. So this is my second time actually going back to Geneva, where I ran the European and Middle East operations, including also Russia. Then went back to the United States and ran the commercial business of Alcon, and then moved over to this particular role. I've been fortunate to, in this role, help change the direction of Alcon, which we'll talk over on this panel, and kind of revamp a little bit the approach of BD&L and M&A at Alcon. And in the last 3 years, probably involved in more than 30 deals overall. So glad to be here.
Thank you, Laurent. Next, Dr. Prabhu Vilusamy is Senior Director of New Venture and Transactions and the lead for Vision and Ophthalmology at J&J's London Innovation Center. He's responsible for the area across EMEA. Prabhu, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Bill. So I trained in the UK as an ophthalmologist, though I left clinical practice quite a while ago, 2008, not as long as Barack, but still quite a while ago. So after I left clinical practice, I joined the Boston Consulting Group and did strategy consulting for about 11 years, purely focused on the life sciences space. So pharma, devices, payer provider, and in recent years, quite a bit of focus on digital data and analytic models. And I joined J&J last year at the London Innovation Centre. And within J&J, I focus on EMEA and ophthalmology. So across all of the areas of our businesses that touch ophthalmology, vision care or contact lenses, surgical vision, and our retinal pharma division within Janssen. And it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite.
Thank you. Frank Chen is Associate Director of Santen Ventures, a corporate venture arm within Santen Pharmaceuticals, and leads the digital and device investments. He's been at Santen since 2015. Please introduce yourself, Frank.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah. So my current role is within the corporate venture arm of Santen Pharmaceuticals, currently leading the digital and device investments. I sit on a number of boards helping to advise companies from a strategic point of view. My background has been in medical device development and digital transformation. To be honest, I'm fairly new to ophthalmology, so I'll save everyone the short history story here. But I will say that I've had so many conversations with experts in the field, from doctors to inventors, that I don't really remember my life before ophthalmology. So hopefully I can share some of those cumulative insights here today.
Thank you, Frank, and welcome to the eye health field. Our last panelist to introduce herself is Rochelle Liu, who is founder and CEO of Ramonchi Capital, which she founded in 2016. She's a member of the fund's investment committee and has a stellar track record prior to founding Ramonchi. Rochelle, please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I'm Rachel, founder and CEO of Ramonchi Capital. Ramonchi was established start of 2016 and focused on the investment of the technology in vision science industry. My university and postgraduate major is engineering and economics. And all my background and the experience in this field start from 2016 when I set up my fund. Before this, I worked as industry executive for many years, relevant with healthcare IT. I like the business can improve living quality. I'm also sitting in the VC panel of Singapore Eye Institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll start on the process. Laurent, maybe if you would lead off and share your perspective on where innovation happens from a kind of an institutional setting standpoint. Private early stage companies, public companies, public institutions, universities, et cetera, corporate leaders. Where do you see innovation being sourced from?
Yeah, so I'll address the answer in two parts, probably on the where, and then we'll talk about the stage itself. But look, on the where, if I recall a little bit, in the past 4 years, a lot of the technologies we've placed an investment or acquired, I would say a lot of them were led on the private side, and probably also with a key involvement from an ECP, an eye care provider, a scientist on the ophthalmology with deep ophthalmology background. I would say that has been kind of like the standard. But I would say that there's an area that I personally would like to have a better visibility on the institutions, probably in the United States, and understanding what universities are working on. I can tell you that Alcon recently, we also were involved in France, for example, which France has a system in place with companies that they've set up throughout France, about 14 of them, managing the portfolio of patents of universities, and their role is to basically commercialize them. And so we've been involved in some deals with that structure. So that was a nice way of maybe kind of showcasing what is happening in some of the institutions and allowing for investments. Right now, we seem to have a more internationalization of the innovation. The U.S. obviously still remains a big bedrock for that. But we have also examples, even in Australia, as you know, it's a strong community there for ophthalmology. But since we are in Israel, I'd like to tell you that about 18 months ago, through our distributor, longtime partner, Alcon, Lapidot Medical, led by Ilan Lapidot, the CEO, we went and did a trip to Israel about 18 months ago. And I was just curious about, how many companies in ophthalmology, and Barack actually was part of this and helped us identify. And we found about 60 companies in ophthalmology, startups, 60. And we were quite surprised. And we got the chance to meet quite a few of them, and also meet some of the people from the Chamber of Commerce in Israel. So I applaud, therefore, the OIS involvement here in Israel, and recognizing the role in ophthalmology, because to this day we've met a lot of great people. We found a lot of interesting technology, and actually we're partnering in a few of them today, and still going on for that. So I think that therefore there's a greater internationalization of where it comes from. I'd like to see and have a better view on institution. I would say Asia still is a place that I personally and my team probably need to spend more time also in understanding and see what's coming out on the Asian side. So that's really on the where. If we talk about the when or the stage, well, that has changed a little bit also for us at Alcon. In the last 4 years, we've tried to basically not have a cookie cutter approach to deal making, but more one that would be tailored in the stage of the innovation itself. And I would say that prior to the last 4 years, Alcon was very much a late stage type of, when thinking about external innovation, Alcon was more comfortable on the late stage. We obviously know what late stage means also, either in terms of the price tag of innovation at that point. Obviously, you get the advantage of having more of a de-risked situation, but you pay a premium for that. And then also it comes shaped in a certain way. And a lot of times you say, well, I wish I had this type of science associated with technology, or that type of science. And you cannot do it because it's so late stage. So we started focusing and looking at things more earlier stage. And what I mean by that is that we've even gotten in partnerships that were pre-POC or pre-proof of concepts. And then the deal structure then becomes, to borrow your term, Bill, on a build to buy, which you've coined, and we've plagiarized and actually try to action on it. And so we are to this day involved in build to buys, which means that a company like a strategic like Alcon gets involved at a smaller investment level and keep going back and de-risking a particular asset as we go along. In totality, basically, it allows you to maybe not pay the premiums that are associated with later stage types of investments. Also, for the company itself, it may help also in the lack of dilution in the traditional venture maybe type of setup. But more importantly, what I've learned on the last 3 to 4 years doing these types of deal is that respecting all the parameters of legal or accounting, you still get to shape the direction, right? When a company like Alcon thinks about innovation or a product, we often think about a TPP, a target product profile, right? So these are going to be all the requirements that we work with the commercial team to determine what would make the success of innovation XYZ. And it can be in terms of a scientific endpoint, or a COGS, a cost of goods endpoint, or a technical endpoint. So when you're able at an earlier stage to even share that, then in a way you help shape the innovation to something that better meets the need of Alcon, but also hopefully the need of the market out there. So therefore, for us, it's been a blessing in working in that fashion, because we're inheriting things that where you don't go, oh, I wish we had seen this kind of data, or I wish we had this. And therefore, you're de-risking as you go along, and you have a much better alignment at what constitutes a successful innovation once it's ready for commercialization. So that's the two key changes that I see in the last at least 3 to 4 years in terms of Alcon's approach to innovation.
Yeah, good. Nice overview. And I know, we know you've been super active in the last while in external innovation. Barack, in terms of what do you see in terms of where is innovation coming from, not geographically, but kind of what type of group or institution is it coming from?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk locally here in Israel, and the way I think, it has a bit changed in the last years. At first, most of the technology we were seeing was coming from private entrepreneurial companies, either an engineer or maybe a doctor that started something, went by himself, raised some money, and started a company. We are seeing now, and that's still probably the biggest case, especially in devices. We do see now, I think, a bit of a shift, seeing technology coming from universities, coming from medical institutions, more on the pharma side, I think. What we have here, I think that changed a lot the local way business is run, is the government incubator system, which gives a good chance for early entrepreneurs to start and maybe get into a proof of concept, and then only need to raise the first round of financing for the company. Again, here in Israel, we see mostly young companies, young startups, the ones, unfortunately, maybe in some cases, the ones that are successful are being sold to Laurent and his friends. And not yet have we been able to build larger companies, but that's the way it runs up here. And what we have seen in the last few years, I think, is that the industry is a little bit maturing, and we see second and third time entrepreneurs. We see better management, experienced management. So I think things are really improving in the sense of development and the ability to do business development across the world for those relatively small companies.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that perspective. I think we're going to talk about the geography. Where geographically are we seeing innovation come from in our field? Maybe Prabhu, why don't you lead off that discussion?
Thank you, Bill. So I think I'll start by saying, there's no single geographic site, I think, that dominates. And one of the strengths of ophthalmology is actually in the preclinical and the clinical setting and the basic science setting, there's a lot of innovation going on across geographies. I think when we look geographically, the major centers today are probably still the major centers that were relevant a few years ago with a couple of additions. So US, Europe, and I'd also put Israel in that mix. It's got a strong heritage, and the major research is still likely to be taking place there. I think Laurent and Barack talked about some of the university shift. I think it's worth kind of considering some of the technologies such as gene therapies, immune modulation, and cell therapies. They're not confined to your classical major ophthalmic centers anymore. And I really think that's an opportunity for real innovation, because a lot of these technologies you can license and you can actually focus on specific disease conditions. And I think Laurent also mentioned Asian markets. I think increasingly Asian markets are going to be more relevant for ophthalmology, not only in terms of the fact that there are large patient pools and there's some really interesting classical ophthalmological research taking place, but there's a lot of non-traditional companies who are becoming increasingly relevant for ophthalmic companies. I'm talking your AR, your ML, your big data players, where there's such a density and depth of talent in those geographies. I think increasingly you'll start to see that becoming relevant for ophthalmology. Yeah. And then if you take a geographic bias, there are some conditions that are naturally more relevant to some geographies than others. So if I take myopia, for example, and progressive myopia, it's far more relevant and pertinent in the Far East than it is top of mind in other markets. And we in J&J have entered into a collaboration with CERI to try and understand the epidemiology and the causes of progressive myopia. And then if you look at some of the emerging markets like India and Africa, again, there's a huge focus there on telehealth, remote health, which is increasingly relevant, I think, in the post-COVID world that we're entering, or still COVID world as probably we're in at the moment. And on Israel in particular, I was really quite impressed when I was over there recently. There's such a density of talent there. And the ecosystem, particularly from a funding perspective, has been touched on already, makes it an extremely attractive place to actually innovate. And we in J&J have set up a partnership with FutureX, and we've launched a call to action in the pharma space. And we've done a couple of investments, both on the vision care side, our contact lens business side, and also our surgical vision side. So, I think Israel in particular has a real density. It's why I'm quite glad that the OIS is virtually being held in Israel this year. And I guess the final thing, which is increasingly, especially with COVID, I've seen a lot of companies which are virtual. And I think that's going to be a trend that's going to increase in the next couple of years. That allows you to have the agility, and it allows you to tap into the best of, irrespective of just anchoring on a single geography. And I think that's a trend that's going to increase going forwards. And I guess the final thing I'll say is, we at J&J, I think, are cognizant that innovation doesn't just happen in a couple of concentrated areas. It's why we set up our innovation center network, 2 in the US, 1 in London covering Europe, and 1 in Shanghai covering Asia. We actively believe that innovation, 95% of the best ideas, 95% of the best talent is not within our 4 walls. And so we have an aspiration to have, bring in the best that we can to J&J. And to date, 50% of our portfolio is externally sourced.
Very good. Thank you, Prabhu. Frank, why don't you share your perspective and how Santen looks at this?
Sure. We take a very similar approach to Prabhu as well, looking globally. But in my experience in the last few years, US is by far the geographic location that has the market share of innovation. Surprisingly to me, though, is the second largest hub has been in Israel. When I did my analysis, it's upward in the mid-teens where innovation is coming from. And I think that's fairly good compared to the relative GDP and population compared to the other large innovation hubs that are coming out of there. Maybe it has something to do with the innovation money that's flowing into Israel. For regenerative medicine, US is still by far the biggest, but I think Japan has been the leader there and is competing very well. So we look there quite a bit. If you look at things like AI, again, US has a large number of companies there, but China, Israel, Singapore are catching up very fast. What's interesting is that I've noticed the AI and telemedicine business models are being innovated a little bit more outside of the US. The US tries to identify opportunities to connect to patients much more seamlessly. But if you look outside, as a result of the developing countries, I think they're trying to also add in access to care at a very cheaper price. So from a business model standpoint, it's very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for those nice perspectives. Rachel, you're based in China.
Yes.
But you also look globally for innovation in our field. Why don't you share your perspective? And I think you'll also be sharing your thoughts on Israel itself.
Okay. I think our speaker already provide very complete global overview. Maybe I can a little more to put something for China angle. You know, as an investor, we investigate from deal flow. According to the local China, deal flow, I see another small proportion from optometry side, like myopia control. This is one of the main problem here. Another interesting thing is the innovative device in China now is more ocular biotissue implant kinds of diagnostic device, such as image device, and also AI screening and diagnosis, like Frank said. Less about comprehensive treatment device. Faster aging society, I think, is a critical issue today China is facing. And that's also we saw more and more deal flow come from back of the eye as innovative drug other than the genetics also grow very fast, I think, in China. From institution part, I saw physician today as a mainstream that more and more divert their interest from publish, high impact paper to translate their research and clinical result to the prototype and form up a startup. I think just in this COVID situation, I received the BP from several physicians in China. They already form up the startup. Maybe the COVID give them more time to do this. And I think at this stage, the government grant can support them a lot. Although my team is based in China, but we do invest a lot in Israel. And maybe because we do business with Israel since 2005, I saw Israel as a hub. You know, this hub is well connected with US, Europe, and more, I think, Great China. It's very interesting. Among all my deal flow, I saw that US still, I think, is dominant, nearly occupying, I think 50%. It's more than 500 companies. And Israel, 20% of this. It means 100 startup in this area I see in Israel. This 100 startup, really describe a miniature ophthalmic innovation landscape. From eye tracking, smart eyewear, digital ophthalmology, digital optometry, teleophthalmology, AI application, and also like ophthalmic kiosks and ophthalmic robots, artificial ocular tissue implant, accommodation, IOL, kinds of the lens technology, laser application, and some interesting drug delivery, innovative drug also, and biopharm technology. And latest, I saw several cannabis solution. I think Israel play a non-replaced role in the ophthalmic innovation territory. Not a big country, but with a wide vision and very good insight of the industry innovative trend with more economic way to acquire the final result. That's aim, I think, to provide the solution for the insurance burden. That's, I think, is a global issue today. That's my input.
Thank you very much. Other thoughts on Israel? We've shared that a bit, and basically the balance of innovation around the globe. Any other perspectives to be shared?
Yeah, Bill, I will share one that goes a little bit into what Prabhu said when he said that 90% of the innovation sits outside of the talents. Some of the innovation sits outside of the walls of J&J. when you think about the natural progression of ophthalmology, and you compare that to the classical core sets, skill sets of a company like Alcon, let's say Phaco and IOLs and things like that, as ophthalmology moves towards the perfecting of outcomes, bringing in a lot of the digital transformation, whether it's data, whether it's artificial intelligence, whatever, you suddenly basically open up a wider net to who can be an innovator and therefore a contributor to the field of ophthalmology. And this is where Israel plays a key role, because there's a wealth of talent in all digital things, whether data or artificial intelligence, that are highly applicable to where the puck is going in ophthalmology and beyond the classical core skill sets of a company even like Alcon. And then, it brings back the debate that, we had about 5 years ago when there was a bit of a polarity about, hey, is it external R&D or internal R&D? I think we've kind of landed in the middle and realizing that because of all these technology evolving into a wider scope of the classical knowledge of ophthalmology and devices, we have to cast a wider net. And therefore, it includes countries like Israel that are rich in those kinds of skill sets.
Yep, thank you. Any other thoughts?
I'll just add that I noticed in ophthalmology already, it's a fairly small circle of experts. And if you get into the Israeli Innovation Center, it's even smaller. And I've noticed that the people working in that industry seem to be fairly collaborative. They work even between different competing companies. And I think that sort of communication and openness helps to drive innovation even further in that field.
That is what happens when you live in a small island.
You have to talk to your neighbors. Well, Barack, one of the thoughts, or the next topic, and we've referenced this a number of times appropriately, is what's the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? What do we feel? What do you see today? And we're all going to pitch in here of current impact, what's going to change, how rapidly, and all. Barack?
Yeah. So definitely it has changed our life in the last few months. Now, actually, in Israel, we are starting to come back to normal. So most of the businesses are open again. People can come back to the office and work at the office. So things are, in a way, coming back to normal. I want to start with a good example, and then we'll go into all the more difficult issues. We have Notar, which is a company that does remote monitoring for AMD patients. And we have been preaching remote monitoring for as long as I remember. And suddenly we have, first of all, a big increase in sales, mainly in the US. You really see an upward trend that started, I don't know, probably a month ago, but a big one. We've seen, of course, a lot of media that helps us. Even the FDA, we're now trying to approve a new device, what we call the home OCT, again for monitoring and diagnosing AMD or diabetes at home. And even the FDA has gave us a fast track and is helping to get this thing along. So that's one of the companies that actually benefited from the corona, but it's probably one of a few. In the rest of the companies, we had some delays, mainly due to clinical trials that have been stopped. We were lucky to come pretty well funded into this crisis, so we didn't have the need to go out and raise money. So in that sense, we're pretty lucky. But I do see here and consult for quite a few companies that things were not so good for them. And getting funding right now or trying to start clinicals right now is pretty difficult. What I was surprised and I think that'll be a trend that will carry on, is how well working from home succeeded. Much better than I imagined. I think we do about the same. In some cases, maybe we're even better working from home. And I guess this trend will probably continue. When you talk to companies, and Laurent can talk about that are marketing products, of course, everything I think went a lot down. Procedures went down, 60% of doctor visits, and so on. I think we'll see that a lot of things will start to be remote. People will not want to come as often as they did to the ophthalmologist. And I think we have the ability and the technology to do a lot of the things remotely. And I think that will probably start as a trend going forward.
Rachel, what's your perspective on the impact of COVID-19? What are you seeing?
Sure. Firstly, we cannot travel abroad, just inside China. But I see that hospital recover well so far, maybe 90% in the patient flow. And all my collaborate hospital restart the clinical trial from this month. And more and more, our activity actually already moved to the cloud. So we already adapt to this. And I believe maybe it will become the normalcy. I see the COVID stimulate the relevant investment in the medical field. I mean, here in China, I saw the digital and some medical device even growth here. In general, I think my business not influenced so much.
Yeah. Prabhu?
Yeah, I'll probably share some general perspectives on what we've seen, especially in funding and investment post-COVID. I think Barack's already talked about, remote monitoring and telehealth. There's a lot more opportunities. I think I've certainly been seeing in that space in the ophthalmology world. M&A has been delayed. In a number of instances, we have seen renegotiation of terms, diligence continuing rather than trying to accelerate and close deals. And venture capital firms have delayed investment. Effectively, they're trying to save some dry powder for their existing portfolio companies, and so have pulled out of syndicates for a number of investments. And VCs are stress testing their portfolio to ensure that they have capital and cash flow to actually support the companies in train. I think the clinical trials piece that was raised before is really interesting. That is going to be, I think, a significant issue in ophthalmology. Increasingly, we're seeing companies trying to be a little more agile. They're using digital as a means of monitoring patients in trials, recruiting patients in trials to avoid that face-to-face interaction. And also, we've seen them pivot sites to geographies where the lockdown and recruitment may be slightly easier. So I think we're probably in the medium term rather than a short-term fix here. And the one other thing that COVID, I think, how it will impact surgeons is elective procedures have stopped in a lot of markets. UK, for example, it stopped. What that's led to is there will be an increase in waiting lists. And so we will see more people, I suspect, go down the private route and the opportunities that presents for out-of-pocket or private medically insured patients to go for premium IOLs.
And Frank, what's your perspective on the impact of the COVID?
So most of my investment companies are in the preclinical stage. So in that area, doesn't have too much of an impact, in my opinion. The companies that are in clinical have seen some delays, especially for recruitment. But I think a lesson learned here is that for companies that are only in a single clinical trial market are much more impacted than those that have looked beyond that and have run trials in multiple markets. Let's see. So the commercial companies that I have actually had some delay as well. So either in delayed POCs or just having delays in their clinical trials as well. besides that, I think corporate culture impact is still unknown for many companies. Working remote, I think works for some people, others it doesn't. So it may be difficult to influence when you're trying to start up a company and have that corporate culture developed.
Yeah, very good. Laurent, Alcon is global. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of activity and surgery and so forth in the U.S.
Yeah, so look, it seems like everybody was expecting that people were going to go through all their scheduled surgeries, if you will, when things reopened up. And that's what's happening. But we are less pessimistic or more optimistic about the ongoing rate of surgery, of new diagnosis, and therefore ability to perform new surgeries. I think that for sure, patients worry about the environment and the sterility of it, may favor the ASC, the ambulatory surgery center approach versus hospitals, because hospitals, by the nature of the size and the people, may not come across as being a safer place to be, if you will. So that's for certain. Another thing that actually probably mentioned was on the elective IOLs or the ATIOLs, refractive advanced technology IOLs. Those require FaceTime, right, in order to tell the patients what their options are and to explain also the purchase and all that. So I think we're seeing, and we're getting doctors asking us, how can you help in that remote work? So we're embarking and looking at digital solutions, some of which we already had, right? We had the screens maybe in the offices that enables you to work up a patient to explain what a toric lens is or a multifocal lens might be. But I think we're going to see more of that, because that's one of the exchanges that the doctors, our partners, are not seeing as mandatory to be face-to-face, because it's a very educating one. And we can leverage all the wonderful digital technologies to do that education and maybe partner in doing that, so that we can make sure we enable the surgeries that require that FaceTime by bifurcating into a more of a digital type of interaction. But we're hopeful that the procedure levels are going to be off, but maybe not to the level we thought about as we're looking at new surgeries being scheduled now.
Yeah, and my perspective is similar, that I see primarily the U.S. geography in most of my companies, and the stage at which they are would really influence how impacted each company is by the COVID situation, preclinical or versus commercial. One of my companies is fully commercial, and was dramatically impacted, had to dramatically downsize, reacted quickly, and thankfully, now 90, 120 days into the so-called crisis, business is coming back, and it looks like things are going to get back to acceptable and potentially normal as we exit this calendar year and go into next year. We know we don't know, the rate at which it will recover and what the overall impact is going to be. I think we're going to wrap up this session, and I would just want to provide a couple of overviews. What's very helpful to me in a discussion like this is that, some of you have heard me say previously, there are 4 constituents that are required for innovation in our field. We need the inventor, the entrepreneur. We need the docs. We need the key opinion leaders, the advanced thinkers, the early adopters. We need capital. And we need global corporate leaders that can help fund and acquire and scale businesses as we go forward. And each of the constituents required in innovation is represented here on the panel today. So thank you for that. The other thing that's so real is innovation resources, both human capital and financial capital, is directed where it is rewarded. And thankfully, over the last couple of decades, there's been an acceleration of positive outcomes that have rewarded the innovation in the eye health ophthalmic sector. It's becoming ever more global. We are becoming more virtual. And so we're able to access, encourage, and connect with each other more efficiently than we ever have. And I'd want to, as we wrap up the conversation, I want to thank the OIS team for helping pull the innovation discussion together, not only in the U.S., but and from a global standpoint. So thank you, panelists. Thanks for sharing your perspective, and stay safe.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you gained some insights from the discussion. Be sure to sign up for the next OIS Virtual Public Company Showcase on July 16th, which is complimentary to our podcast subscribers. Visit OIS.net and sign up today.